Thanks for coming. So today we're going to present to you some of the results of a study that June and I and Steve Barnes, who is also a senior research scientist at CSIRO, did over the last 2-3 years. We've been working on this, 2 years approximately. So, and it's looking at the Kevitsa Ni-Cu-PGE mine in northern Finland, which has a huge amount of assay, like a huge assay database. And we worked together to try and find a good way of modeling and using that assay database to get a good model of the ore compositions. So, what the Kevitsa intrusion is what we call a layered intrusion. So it's a large mafic, ultramafic intrusion. The characteristic of this intrusion is that they often display compositional layering. That layering is either very obvious, like you can see here, where you've got in black here are chromitite layers, and then in white are anorthosite, which is just basically just plagioclase. But quite often they're very much not that obvious, and they're quite cryptic. And that's the case for the Kevitsa intrusion. And these intrusions, quite a lot of them actually contain ore bodies of copper, nickel, PGE, chromium, vanadium, depending on the composition of the intrusions and the processes at play. And so the interesting thing about these intrusions is that the layering that you observe within them gives you actually a lot of information about the genetic magmatic processes that produce the ore body. And so it is important to have a good, meaningful way of visualizing these variations in 3D. So this is a map of the Kevitsa intrusion. So we're located in northern Finland here, close to Sodankylä, for people who know Finland. And so the intrusion here is mainly represented in purple here. And that's the surface expression of the ore body here in black. So it's a mafic, ultramafic intrusion which contain low-grade, fairly low-grade disseminated sulfides, nickel, copper, PGE sulfides. And there's variations within the ore body which we're going to look at. This is what the ore looks like. So that's when there's very little sulfides to no sulfides. So that's basically what the intrusion itself looks like, which is a lot of pyroxenes, plagioclase, olivines. These here are 3 elemental maps of the samples, which we obtained by using micro XREF mapping. And here you've got iron in blue, calcium in green, and sulfur in red. And so for the mineralized sample here, you can see the sulfides, which are in purple. So they're rich in sulfur and iron. And then you also have plagioclase, pyroxene, and olivines. So that's what the ore looks like. And then what we're looking at in particular is the actual composition of these sulfides. And that's the variation of the composition of these sulfides that we've been trying to describe within the whole ore body. So this is what they gave me when I first went to Kevitsa. This is the 3D model that they had. So that's the outline of the intrusion itself. So that's looking in this direction here. So that's the going at depth. And so that's the outline of the intrusion. So that's good. And then the only thing that had been actually modeled were this, which they called Fred, which was a ultramafic body within the intrusion, and these, which were the ore bodies. When really, the ore body is this whole area here, and they're just variations in tenors within the ore body. So that's what I had to work with. So we thought we could do a little bit better than that. And especially since they had a gigantic assay database with over 90,000 analyses, and a large proportion of those actually had the full suite of PGEs, which is a huge amount of money, but anyway. So we decided to look at that assay database. We did some kind of basic ore classification, because they have different types of ores that they had recognized within the mineralization. So first of all, we took out everything that had less than 0.5% sulfur, and we called it non-ore. Then we took everything that had less than 2% nickel, and we called it false ore, which is basically rich in sulfur but very low in metals. So it's what we call false ore. So they mine it, but really it's not very economic. Then we took this whole section here, which has more than 2% sulfur, nickel, but less than 10%, and we separated it in two parts. This, which is so over 2% nickel, but less than 1,500 ppm palladium. And so palladium is a good element to represent all of the PGEs in general within the intrusions, which are all very well correlated. And then this here, which is what we call the moderate nickel high palladium ore. And then finally, anything which had more than 10% nickel, we call the high nickel, and usually also has high PGE, so high palladium ore. So these are the different ore types that we've defined, and they match quite well with what they call the false ore, the normal ore, and the high nickel, high PGE ore. And then we plotted everything, just one assay is 1 point, and they just had the colors, and that's what we had. So the outline of the intrusion, which you don't see here, is actually somewhere down around here. And that's the outline of, well, that's where the drilling is, and that's where the mineralization is. So we could see that there were some interesting variations within the mineralization in function of the tenors of the sulfides, but we couldn't really quite pinpoint everything. There's a lot of noise in there. And so really, we needed a way to actually have a better visualization of this data and lump and domain everything. And that's when we went to see June to try and see if she had an answer for our question. So yes, that's what I just said. And so we decided to use one of June's methods, which is using the continuous wavelet transform and the tessellation methods to actually lump all units together and get a better visualization of our 3D model. And I'll let June take over from now. So this is the workflow, what we decided to do. So a big data cleanup, which I just told you about, where we got rid of everything that had less than 0.5% sulfur. We calculated the tenors, which is basically just the actual metal concentrations of our ore, of our sulfides. And then we applied the tessellation and so on. So I'll just let you.
Okay, thanks. I've got my own pointer because it's brighter. Okay, it's not better. Okay, so this basically outlines the steps, but I'll go through the steps in a bit more detail. Where do I point this? Just here?
Yeah, that's back forwards. That's the pointer.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, so the method we used was about multiscale boundary detection, and we were after the multiscale aspect of the boundary detection because we didn't know how much we wanted to upscale the model until we actually did it and had a look and went, yeah, that's how far we wanted to go. So the idea of multiscale is basically a smoothing idea. So if you have a signal, it's got a lot of noise in it originally, but if you start smoothing the signal, then you get rid of the small, weak features, and then you just retain the bigger features. And if you smooth it even more, then you can get rid of the middle features, and then you just end up with the biggest features. And the second aspect is the boundary detection. So in image analysis, the way to detect boundaries is to use the inflection points on the signal. So, for example, if you've got a signal that's got a low area and a high area, the inflection point is the steepest gradient. And that's generally considered the best estimate of where the boundary is between the low area and the high area. So in your original signal, this is just a hypothetical signal, because of the small-scale features, you'll have lots and lots of boundaries, which we weren't interested in, okay, because you saw from the picture that it was really noisy, and we couldn't really see the big features because of all the noise. So if you start to smooth it, then you get fewer and fewer boundaries the more you smooth it. So this is basically the concept behind what we were trying to do. Okay, and there's a really nice mathematical technique called the continuous wavelet transform, and what it does is it continuously smooths your signal, and it detects the boundaries as you smooth the signal. So here's a signal. This is sulfur % down one of the drill holes. And you can see, there's a general area here which is high. This area is sort of medium, and then there's these lower features, these small lower features. Okay, and this is what the continuous wavelet transform looks like. Now, when I first did this, I thought, great, we're continuous wavelet transform is going to solve all our problems. And I produced this, and I went, I don't really know what to do with this picture because it's unintuitive. It doesn't tell you much about what's going on. The wavelet coefficients actually tell you, the colors here are the wavelet coefficients, and they actually tell you how strong the features are. And the black lines here are where you've got zero contours between highs and lows. And what they represent, this is the second derivative. So if you think about a curve, so this is a Gaussian curve in black here. If you take the second derivative, which is the blue curve, the zero crossings here are actually the inflection points. So every place that we've got a zero contour, that represents an inflection point in the signal. So if you think about this lower area going to a higher area, the inflection point is here, okay, which corresponds to this. But the problem with this is that as you go up, as you smooth the signal and you go to higher and higher, smoother and smoother, higher and higher scale, which corresponds to smoother and smoother wavelet transform, the wavelets interfere with each other. So the boundaries interfere with each other. And so the wavelets the zero contours start to go all over the place. And that's what makes the picture so hard to understand. What you can do is you can depth correct those contours. So for example, this one here, which is clearly a very major boundary because it extends to very high scales, the nice thing about the derivative of Gaussian wavelet is that the theory behind it says that the true location of this boundary is the point at which it converges at smallest scale. So the true location of this complex boundary is actually here. So I can depth correct that to a straight line. Okay, and that's what I've done with all of these. And the scale to which persists is the scale to which they persist in here. So for example, if we have a look at, say, this boundary here, which is this feature here, it only persists up to about 10, 20, 30 meters. Okay, so 30 meters is where it stops. So this feature here is representing this one. Okay, so this is what I did, was I converted that really hard to understand wavelet transform into something that looks like geology. And the colors in this is the mean value of the signal over that depth range. So over this depth range here, we've got very high values. Over this depth range here, we've got lower values and so on. So, and that's very low there, the white corresponding to this bit. So now you can immediately look at this picture and you can go, well, you know, over the very large scale picture, if I was only interested in really big features, there's really only one boundary, and this area here is generally high and this area is sort of moderate. But if I'm interested in smaller scale features, I'll gradually move over this way, and it starts to split up into smaller and smaller features. So it was a way to look at the whole drill hole in a multi-scale way. Okay, now, I've subsequently modified this algorithm. When we did this work, you had to go through 2 steps to get the information we wanted. Now, I've subsequently modified the algorithm, so we only have to do 1 step, but I'll tell you the way we did it here. Okay, so initially what I devised was what I wanted to do was, even though you can filter by scale, that wasn't the optimal way I wanted to filter. I actually wanted to filter by wavelet coefficient. So I wrote a filter which would filter this whole thing and get rid of the features that had a low wavelet coefficient. What that means is it gets rid of weak features. Okay, so all these little bits of noise are really weak features. And you can see when you start filtering it, you can get rid of all those all these little things which represent all these little ripples. You can get rid of it and you can smooth the whole thing out. Okay, and at the end of the day, then you've got a nice, clean image, get rid of all the noise, and then you can say, well, what scale do I want to look at it? And in this case, we always just filtered it until the smallest scale gave us the level of domaining that we wanted to do. So then I can select it at 1 scale and I can say, well, this is the domaining I want for sulfur. Okay, but because it was a multivariate classification, we had to, and this method only works on 1 variable at a time, the continuous wavelet transform. What we had to do is individually filter all 3 variables for our classification, which was sulfur, the nickel, and the palladium tenors, and then just combine the boundaries. Yes?
Yeah, I just got to add something before you keep on going. I didn't tell you too much about why we decided to choose those 3 variables in particular. So we chose sulfur, well, to decide whether it was sulfide and whether it wasn't. And then nickel was representing was a good representative for the general base metals, so nickel, copper, cobalt, and palladium was the most representative element for all of the PGEs within the intrusion. And so we only chose these three elements to represent general variations within the whole ore body.
Okay. So what we did then was combine the boundaries together. So all those boundaries, the red boundaries here represent the boundaries from sulfur, the green from the nickel, and the blue boundaries from the palladium. Okay, and then now we've got a multivariate boundary system. And any boundaries that were very close together, I just merged. Okay, then on those now we can take the data from each of these combined domains. We can use that classification system that Margaux outlined, and then we end up classifying the domains. And you can see a lot of the domains fell under the same classification. So if they were the same classification, we just simply merged them together if they were adjacent. So here's the results for a subset of the holes. So if you were to classify by every interval, this is what it would look like. But if you domain it first and you choose some upscaling that you think would work, you can see how much more simple it is. And you can see, for example, like this domain here, which had lots of small noisy units in it, you completely cleaned it up. And maybe this blue domain here, it's nice and clean now. So it's done a really good job of just getting rid of all those unwanted minor noise features. Okay, and then we could vary how much we filtered it until we came to a classification level that we liked. Okay, so here's the original classified by each sample. Here we got a 50% filter, so we've removed the wavelet coefficients that came up to 50% of the total. And here we've gone 70%, so a stronger filter. And you can see you're progressively removing units as you go stronger and stronger filter. And so the nice thing about filtering, because you could think, oh, well, in Leapfrog I could just coalesce everything together by merging small intervals and throwing away small intervals. The nice thing about this thing that it does is that you can see here's a small unit, almost the same size as this unit. That one's not preserved, and this one is. Why is that? It's because this is very similar. This one had a very similar value to its surroundings, whereas this one was very different. Okay, so the wavelet coefficients will preferentially get rid of weak features rather than narrow features, and this is really important, particularly in mineral exploration, where often the things you're really interested in are small, but they represent big differences. And you don't want to throw away things just because they're small. You want to throw away things because they're not much different to what's around them.
Quick question, if you don't
Yes?
mind. I see you've got a red-yellow, which would be kind of a medium gray to go up.
That one?
Yeah, right there. It completely disappears. And then you've got one on top that looks like a mixture of high and nothing. That
Yep.
actually shows up as high. So it kind of has the opposite effect of what's happening down at the bottom of that 300, 400.
Yeah, and that would be, like, if you look at the actual signal, in fact, ask me this question again at the end of the talk, because I have a slide particularly, which shows the signals, and it shows why it does what it does. Because basically it's the smoothing. So it would have said that on average, they were perhaps, the cutoff was very close to the threshold on one side on one, and very close to the threshold on the other side. So by looking visually at it, you're going, okay, well, categorically, they look really different. But if I looked at the real signal values, and when I smoothed it and averaged it out through smoothing, that actually then it pushes it into one category or the other. But I can show you at the end, if you like. That's all from me.
All right, so
Do you want that?
now we're going to have a look at... Oh, good. Can you hear me? Yep. So this is what I showed you earlier. So this is just all of the data without any filtered, without the tessellation, without anything. And now this is the data after we've gone through the whole process that June just described over there. So you can see how we've simplified the whole model and how now we can see trends a lot better within the whole ore body. So that's with a 70% filtered, so it's a really high filtered. If we wanted to, if there were some areas where we were more interested in small, small scale variations, we could go to a 50% filtered if we wanted to. We decided for our purposes and for the interpretations that we wanted to get from looking at the variations of tenors within the mineralization, we went all the way to a 70% filtered, but that's just a choice. So if we zoom in some areas, so here now we're looking at this area here of the model. So that's before the tessellation, that's after. And now get to another area, we go over here, that's before the tessellation, and that's after. So we really get a really nicely cleaned up result of the whole database, and it's been done really quickly. How much time does it actually take to run the 12 minutes through the whole database, and you go from this to this. It's objective, like I haven't had to decide where to put the boundaries or anything, and it's systematic, so it's the same for every single drill hole. So now we're going to get into the geology side of it, just to try and look at what these variations within the intrusion actually, we think, mean. So that's just an interpretation. So that's the outline of the intrusion here. These are the variations after the tessellation, and what we think we're seeing. So in blue here, you have what we call the false ore, which was the ore which has rich in sulfur, very low in metals, which you find on the edges of the intrusions, some bits and pieces in the middle of the ore body, but mainly all around. Then you've got what we call the moderate nickel low palladium ore, which is in green here. So it's mainly at the bottom here of the ore body, so it's represented here in green. Then we've got the moderate nickel high palladium, which is sulfides which are a bit more enriched in metals and in PGEs, which is represented in yellow. So they're all over the upper part here and a bit in this area here. So we represented it here just schematically. And then finally you have what we call the high nickel high PGE ore, which is a really high grade ore, which was mainly in some areas towards the top of the intrusion here on the sides. So represented here. So that's the interpretation that we got out of looking at this data after the tessellation technique. So let me know if I got too far in what I think that means, geology-wise. So basically what we think is happening here within the intrusion is that as the intrusion is forming, you're pumping more and more magma within the intrusions. And so basically, how do you get that enrichment in metals of the sulfides? So that's by having more interaction between the sulfide droplets and the silicate melt, because the silicate melt is what is rich in metals, but you need to get that metal from the melt into the sulfides somehow. So you need them to interact together. And the metals will like the sulfides better, so they will easily go into the sulfides, but they do need to interact with the magma for that to happen. And that's what we call the R factor. And so this is just a curve with our assay database. That's nickel tenor, that's palladium tenor. And the colors here represent the different ore types. And what you can see is that as you increase the R factor, which is the amount of interaction that you have between your sulfides and your silicate melt, you increase the metal tenor of your sulfides. So you enrich your sulfides. So what we think is happening is that as the intrusion builds up, the R factor increases and the sulfides get more and more enriched. And so if we look at a little drawing that I had fun doing, we think that the whole system starts by just being an interconnected sill sediment complex, where you get a lot of the country rocks into the intrusion. So the complex is choked with country rock inclusions. So you add sulfur to the system, but you don't add that much metals. So you create really low tenor sulfides. Then you keep pumping magma through the chamber. So you increase the size of your magmatic chamber. And so your sulfides that you've created by getting sulfur from the country rock gets a bit more enriched. And you keep going. You get into a freely conducting magma chamber. You increase, again, the tenor of your sulfides. But while that's happening, you still have some areas of the intrusion that are going to start crystallizing. You are going to start creating cumulus phases, mainly olivine, plage pyroxenes, depending on where you are. And you're going to start to have, so that's what we call the false ore here, which is really high in sulfur, low in tenors. And then as you keep going, as you crystallize more and more, you slowly lock in the different types of sulfides that you've created while the intrusions was growing. and you end up with that kind of geometry. That's what you see in the model that I just showed you. So that's what we think is happening. And so, yeah, so these are the conclusions. So I think we're going to share that. But basically, on my side, my point of view is that this technique was extremely quick. We got it to run through our whole assay database, 90,000 assays, really quickly, and we got a very objective visualization of the tenor of our ores, which actually helped us interpret the whole genetic processes behind the formation of this ore body. So yeah, as I said, very consistent and objective. I think most of the other conclusions are yours, June.
I think you covered them all.
Consistent results, time saving, and I think one of the things that June talked about earlier, which is really important, is that you don't get rid of the weak features. So you still see the important variations, you still see them even if they're small, which is really important in our case. For example, the high nickel, high PGE ore, they're usually small intervals, but they are the most enriched part of the ore body, and they are really important to locate within the system. There's another story there, because there's also some assimilation of really high nickel contour rock xenoliths in the intrusion, and by locating this high nickel PGE ore, we actually locate those xenoliths most of the time within the whole intrusion. So that's a bit more geology. And I think that's all for us. Thank you.